Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Colgrove, who is the co-founder and CTO of Hex. Hex makes it easy to analyze data with SQL and Python, collaborate with others in real time, and then publish work as an interactive data app anyone can use. Caitlin previously was a director of engineering at Remix, a public transportation planning startup, and a longtime engineer at Palantir. During our conversation, we're going to talk more about the evolution of the notebook, what role collaboration really plays in data, and the future of data apps and dashboards. Caitlin is incredibly thoughtful about what's missing from the data experience today.
Yeah, the thing that this conversation really made me think hard about was the different ways that collaboration could manifest. I'm a Hex user, and I didn't realize how much care had been put into the product from a real-time collaboration perspective. And it made me think just about how different the Git workflow with pull requests and merges and everything, how different that is from Google Docs, and how it's not clear that either of those modes of collaboration is exactly what one is looking for when collaborating with other members of your data team. I know that Caitlin certainly thought a lot about this. It's to a certain extent an unanswered question, so it hopefully will help tickle everyone's neurons.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's are we just not imaginative enough to understand what the possible real-time collaboration looks like in analytics? Or is there a different kind of collaboration that just involves individual work and handoffs as a team? I think it's a really interesting topic, and I'm excited for us to jump in on this episode. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Caitlin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here.
I know we are going to have a lot to talk about in the work that you're doing at Hex, but I just wanted to start with you as a person, starting before your time at Hex. I don't know if you know this, but you're our second guest in a row who went to Stanford, and this makes me very sad because Stanford rejected my application, and so I will forever feel inadequate around both you and Julia. Julia really sings the praises of Stanford, apparently just it's a wonderful place. Whatever. I'm curious if you had such glowing reviews. What was special about your time at Stanford? What did you love about it?
One of the things that there's a couple things that I really appreciated about Stanford. I think from a cultural perspective, I was looking at Stanford and I was looking at a bunch of East Coast schools. And one of the things that I loved, and it was just immediately apparent to me when I showed up on campus as, for their admitted students weekend or whatever, was just how, everyone just seemed so happy all the time. They're this is a beautiful campus. The weather is perfect all the time. I'm just so, happy to be here. And there was this whole vibe of just I don't know, everybody was walking around in a big group and just including everybody else. And we were all kind of friends together from the beginning. And that I did think continue in sort of my time at Stanford, where I didn't really feel like it was the social dynamics were super cliquey or anything like that. I felt like it was just this whole big group of people who are, like learning and like having fun. And then I think the other thing that is a little bit more obvious about Stanford is that their computer science program is phenomenal. And
You don't say.
Yeah, you don't say. But I seriously don't think I would have been a software engineer if I hadn't gone there.
Huh.
I was looking at hard sciences, various things. And it wasn't until I started taking real computer science classes at Stanford and I started procrastinating doing my math and physics homework by working on these programs that I realized that, maybe I should pick a different major.
That was one of the places I wanted to go with you. I always love hearing stories of how I got into computer science. It sounds like Stanford was determinative there. Was it a class? Talk more about that.
In terms of the way that they do, there's a few things. In terms of the way they do the teaching there, and this in some ways I think will lead into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about later. They have this great setup at the beginning where they build a bunch of structure around the initial set of programs that you write. They have a bunch of libraries, they have a bunch of little graphics things that you can use in ways that allow you to kind of focus on the core learning materials for loops, whatever data structure graphs it is that you're using today. But the output is still something super compelling. I remember the first program that I wrote there was we were building, if you're familiar with John Conway's Game of Life, like we were building that. And I didn't have to worry about a bunch of the nuances of like actually drawing pixels on the screen, which I would have been totally unprepared for. But I could think about sort of the algorithms and the actual logic behind it, which was super interesting. So I think that's one thing that they did really well, which gives people, rather than them coming in being super bored, being like, I have to memorize a bunch of Java keywords, it kind of gives them a little bit of a compelling goal carrot at the end of this to be like, when you go through this program, you'll be able to build all of these really cool things, and to see that from the very beginning. And I think that's one big reason why Stanford has so many computer science majors, even people who don't necessarily want to go into software engineering.
I was not a computer science major, but many of my friends were. I went to Maryland, and Maryland has a good program too, but I think it was maybe a little older school, or maybe it's just that, I went to college in the dark ages, but there wasn't like such care taken with the experience of the student. And to a certain extent, the fact that it was hard and impenetrable, and that like a lot of students failed out in the first year, like that was not seen as a problem. Treating it in the other way feels like obviously good, obvious progress.
Yeah, I actually was a section leader, which is sort of an undergrad TA light at Stanford. They have so many people in their computer science programs that they don't have enough grad students to teach all of them. But it was actually an amazing experience. As an undergrad, I taught these intro classes for several years. And the thing that I really took away from it is that Stanford has when I left, there was something ridiculous, like 95% of people took one of these intro CS classes. So really, when I say like learning computer science, it's less about, you're being a genius or, this sort of myth of this 10x programmer or whatever, and more about actually the attention that you pay to the tools and the structure and the support that you provide for people who are otherwise smart and motivated and all of these things. And a lot of people I saw so many people, often women, quite frankly, who come in just being like,
yeah,
I could never do that. But then you have this really wonderful introductory program that allows them to kind of develop these skills without throwing them in the deep end. And I think that's just like, the difference is so stark between programs that don't do that and programs that do.
The most famous professor teaches the intro class with a lightsaber, and he throws candy at the students every single class. So it really is fun and games until you get to 107.
The other club that you're a part of that a lot of folks on the outside would be interested to learn more about is the Palantir Club. And so I know that there are autonomous agents that are scrubbing the entire internet for all ex-employee mentions of their time at Palantir. So I know that you can't violate your 18 NDAs, but what can you share about that experience? What was special about that environment?
I think a lot of Palantir's rep for secretiveness is actually just that they never really marketed themselves to a pretty wide audience. They were all always targeted at these like very, very large, super duper enterprise contracts. And so there's just not a lot of awareness of the types of things that they were building.
Sure.
When I think about it, in many ways, especially sort of my later time at Palantir, when I was working on at the time, their very nascent data integration enterprise data product. Looking back, a lot of it, I think they were actually quite ahead of the curve on a lot of the trends that I'm seeing today in sort of the more broader open data stacks.
I feel like I heard from somebody that there was a DBT-like thing there. I don't know that much about it, but it seems like SQL data transformations inside of a warehouse was a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't quite SQL, although SQL was involved. We were actually more of a Java shop.
Okay.
But it was this same kind of like, do your data transformation pipelines in stages with testing and code in a way that sort of brings in a bunch of software engineering best practices into this data pipeline. And they had a similar thing where they would have these sets of table transformations, and that would be your data pipeline. And I think conceptually, it was, I think, very much in the spirit of what DBT is trying to accomplish. I think they made some different technology decisions, and I think that does have impacts on the accessibility of it in a lot of ways. But ultimately, it was some of the same core ideas there.
It seems like there are some of these environments, and Airbnb is one of them. Airbnb tends to write a lot about the stuff that they do, but environments where, because of the size and the forward thinkingness that they are, the folks involved in those organizations get to a little bit live in the future for the rest of us. And so then you like leave and you say like, well, what did I have access to in that organization that like doesn't exist in the rest of the world yet? Is that at all what led to Hex?
Yes and no, I think. I do think that it's pretty common for people to leave Palantir and be like, oh man, I wish I had this thing, or I wish I had that thing, or I wish I had this other thing. Hex is a little bit like that, but I actually think more Hex is a response to some things that we built at Palantir that, at least for me, I feel like I didn't get quite right. I think in many ways, I see some of the analytics side of these things being even a little bit coming in a little bit even after some of the data engineering side in terms of the development of kind of best practices and theses around how this should work. And so back then, even though Palantir had this super robust data engineering side, we were still kind of muddling around and exploring different paradigms for the analytics side. And I worked on a bunch of different versions of this, none of which I think actually quite hit the mark. So in a lot of ways, circling back around, kind of seeing what's out there in the space today, I feel like Hex tries to build on a bunch of the stuff that we learned there and make something that's actually the tool that we would have wanted and that our users would have wanted back then.
Just to echo that experience, sometimes I'll use the word failure. I don't need to put that word into your mouth, but at the last company that I was at, RJ Metrics, we were early on in some of the trends that have played out and ended up catching a big part of the transition that's happened with Stitch. Stitch came out of RJ Metrics, but there were other things that we had built internally as well, including a transformation layer that at the time was all based in Hadoop. And it was just kind of like wrong place, wrong time. It just didn't end up coming together. But I had such a fertile ground to learn from like what didn't work there when I got to go and do my next thing.
Yeah, I think that's very, very similar to how I feel about some of the stuff that I built there.
So why don't we back up just a minute? We've been making a lot of mention of Hex, but I don't think we actually talked about what is Hex. Like, what was the inspiration for Hex? What does it do for people today? Just walk us through a little bit about the problem that it is solving.
In some ways, we have all this background building analytics tools in general, but in some ways, the genesis of Hex is actually a very, very acute, specific problem. And that is trying to marry sort of the accessibility and shareability of traditional BI. So, no one ever has a problem building a Tableau dashboard and sending it to someone, or building an Excel spreadsheet and sending it to someone, with the power, the analytical power of something like a code notebook. There was basically at Barry's previous job, quite frankly, Barry's our CEO, he was literally looking to try to buy something that did this. All of the data teams were working in Python code notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, and building these, it was actually a pretty sophisticated data team. They had pretty heavy operational work that required a lot of this backing analytics. But the executive team just had no ability to actually consume these things. What are you going to do? Email them a Jupyter notebook? And so they were falling back on all of these copying and pasting charts into decks. And we saw this over and over again in the different teams that we talked to. The more sophisticated teams would be doing things like, they would take their notebook and push it up to whatever their cloud system was and run it on a schedule and dump it into Snowflake. Probably that was like flowing into dbt or something, which was then downstream was Looker. And like, that's how they would actually get all of the analytics done. And it just seemed like there had to be a better way to do this. And so that's kind of how Hex was born. It was really the combination of the realization that these analytics workflows were deeply, deeply collaborative at the very heart of them, both between the different analysts and also between analysts and the rest of the company. And that the tooling to do that just really hadn't caught up with today's sort of modern code-based analytical workflows. And so really that's the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty universal problem. Like, different personas at companies have different tools to solve their use case. You'll have analysts or data scientists very deep in notebook world. Once you're talking about business users, it's much better often to have a curated dashboard or presentation like a Tableau. One of the things that I'm hearing is like Hex bridges those two worlds where you can get something that's really shareable and curated, but also interactive, that feels like a notebook for the producers of the data. What is it about the notebook framework that you think is just has so much staying power? Like, why has it been so popular over the years?
Code notebooks are probably the best tool out there today for a bunch of workflows. Basically, these rapid, REPL-like, interactive, iterative analyses. And, you have Jupyter, you have things like RStudio, you have Mathematica, you have a bunch of these tools that were basically developed around this, and some of the pioneers in the space that have these huge, vibrant communities around them. And quite frankly, they're the best things out there to do some of these, particularly the exploratory part of that. And I think that's going to remain true for a while. But I do think that there's a class of workflows that are emerging, especially over the last couple of years, and we sort of at Hex see them growing into the future. That, while notebooks are good for a certain set of things, the existing technologies today don't necessarily map exactly onto what people want to do. I think a good example would be something like cloud data warehouses. If you're using a Jupyter kernel on cloud data warehouse scale data, I think you're going to have a lot of problems doing that. And so sort of trying to think about like, okay, well, how can we take this notebook paradigm, which is so powerful and so fast and so flexible, and move that a little bit into these sort of technical analyst workflows that we're seeing a lot of today.
Got it. And you made a decision for Hex. You support Python and SQL. Is that right? What was the decision there for not supporting like R or Julia or some of the other languages?
So I will say those are on the roadmap is I think the way I'll say it. And the reason we started with Python, and we started with Python sort of as the like maximally flexible language that we could choose. One principle that we're sort of designing this tool for that we kind of talk about internally is like low bar, high ceiling. We really don't want people to hit the limit of Hex.
I'm going to steal that. That's so good. We think in the same terms. And now I hope you weren't attached to you being the only person who uses that phrase.
No, I think it's great. I think it's this like duality of we don't want it to be intimidating to people coming in who just want to come in and write a little bit of SQL or write a little bit of Python and making that experience really pleasant and smooth. But also I've just seen so many people have these monstrous dashboards and various like Excel spreadsheets and things where they've just clearly topped out and hit the maximum level of complexity that these tools can support. So anyway, back to the sort of Python and SQL thing. We chose Python because we felt like it had the highest ceiling to start. But when we were doing, as we were building this, when we were doing research into the users and of the particular profile and the particular workflows that we were looking at, what we actually discovered is that, as I'm sure you're aware, many people, most of their workflow is actually in SQL, not in Python, who are doing a lot of these analytics. And so it became pretty clear to us that having first-class SQL support was going to be critical to making this a good user experience for these folks. And so we added SQL support when that happened. And I think similarly, pulling off R, Julia, other languages that people, Scala, I don't know, people are using to do some of these analytics things, we'll be knocking them off one by one. But for now, Python and SQL actually capture a pretty large number of those folks, and we can work on making other parts of the experience good as well.
Well, notebooks are so powerful because they give you this environment to do like ad hoc investigations or explorations really easily. But they get bad reputation sometimes because they're local on your desktop, you work in silos, you aren't really collaborative. What exactly are you doing in Hex that's different to maybe make some of the best practices for version control or making it really collaborative a first principle of what you're building?
There are a lot of things that we've built for this. A couple I'll just highlight a few of them, and I'm happy to talk about any other ones that might be interesting to you or that you've sort of seen in the product. One thing I do want to highlight is versioning and version control, which is something that is notoriously difficult for notebooks. We have basically a first implementation of that by default in the product. It's fairly simple and straightforward. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of Git, but it basically gives you things like the ability to, we call it publishing, but it's basically like merging to master is effectively how it's implemented. And so to have some of these basic controls around what is actually live and some contract around, not losing all of your work and things like that. I think there's a couple different models of collaboration. That's more on this sort of asynchronous side of collaboration. We also have commenting and things for, review and pull request type workflows. And then on the other side, one of the other major features that we have, which I think gets more to the sort of liveness and sharing of it, is we have real-time collaboration. And we can talk a lot about the details of real-time collaboration, what it's useful for and what it's not useful for. But the fact of the matter is, in 2021, people just expect as a baseline that anything that's hosted in the cloud is going to be syncing between different computers and like is editable by multiple different people at the same time. Google Docs has been around long enough that that's just sort of a baseline standard. And so we actually built that in from the get-go in terms of our architecture. It's all based around this kind of real-time collaboration framework that we have.
Can I play devil's advocate there really quick?
Sure.
I want to be told here that I don't get it and there's a new way of working and I haven't learned it yet. But in general, two software engineers won't work in the same function in the same file at the same time. Like what you were calling the asynchronous mode of collaboration is like what's facilitated via Git. And that tends to be like how software engineers imagine collaborating. And that tends to be the unit of work that I think about when I think about collaborating with other data people. I'm trying to understand like what it is that I'm missing. Like, am I not imagining something because I'm constrained by my tools?
No, so I actually agree with you. And I don't think, in general, we actually designed our system around this. We actually don't really believe that it is useful or perhaps even desirable to have the ability for two engineers to be editing like this, literally the same block of code at once. I think that's just asking for trouble in terms of getting in the way of things. So yeah, so I totally agree on that front. Our real-time collaboration is more around, the other properties of the document at the same time. So like, let's say that, you're working in one cell and then I come in and I add a cell at the bottom. That works just fine. Or even if I just like, we're on a meeting and we're talking about this notebook and I like change something, it will show up on my screen as well as your screen. It turns out that tech is exactly the same as the tech that you would do for sort of multiplayer editing. A lot of the syncing stuff just can be reused there. So that's the level of multiplayer editing that we have and we support. And we also have things like, you can see someone's editing this cell right now and a few things like that. But yeah, I agree that some of the like really simultaneous stuff, like the type of stuff that you see like in Google Docs, you have like two cursors in the same paragraph.
Yeah.
We actually don't support that partly for technical reasons and partly for user experience reasons, because we don't actually think people should be really doing that.
Got it.
So I'm not wrong in assuming that building this is really hard to get real-time collaboration where you have multiple people working on the same Hex app at the same time. That's difficult to pull off technically, but it felt like that needed to be designed into what you were building. How hard was that? What kind of decisions did you have to make from a design and engineering standpoint? Would love to just hear how you pulled it off.
That's right. It's quite challenging to build, and it's even more challenging to build after the fact. So pretty early on, we knew that if we ever wanted to do this, we had to build it in sort of from the get-go. And this actually wasn't even the very, very start of the code base. It was maybe like 6 months in. So we already had a fair amount of stuff that we'd written. And yeah, in designing that, the tricky thing about a lot of these algorithms is a couple things. So there's a few different ways of doing this out there. So there's one algorithm for doing real-time collaboration, which is called operational transforms. Google actually sort of pioneered this model with a lot of their Google Docs work. And then there's a more recent model called conflict-free replicated data types, or CRDTs. And in a lot of ways, you're starting to see a lot of things based off that. Like Figma does something around these, and a lot of the newer stuff is using these. And we did a whole big, part of the reason this was challenging was because we did a whole big set of research, technical research around like, okay, well, what are the technologies we're using, like GraphQL and React and various different things, and what's the support for OT libraries out there, and what's out there for CRDTs. And having used OT in the past, it's very verbose. It sort of has a lot of baggage with it, at least the implementations that I've used. But a lot of the stuff that we were seeing with CRDT was just not quite ready for prime time, is sort of how it felt. And plus, on top of that, nobody had ever really done anything with Apollo and GraphQL, which was our main state management framework. And so all of that is to say that we had to do something sort of a little bit novel there, looking at a bunch of different prior art from Figma and Observable and a bunch of these other places. And we ended up with something that was a little in the middle. It kind of takes some of the aspects of OT and some of the aspects of CRDT, simplifies them a little bit. So we give up things like, multi-cursor editing, but we gain the ability to much more easily reason about the state of the system. And yeah, we actually went and then implemented that, and we've been building on it ever since. I think in some glorious future, I would love to open source this library, because I think it could be so useful for anybody who's using GraphQL, which is not natively real-time by any stretch of the imagination, to kind of plug and play, but it's not there yet. Would love to do that at some point, though.
This is like a good tie to like one of the things that I wanted to talk about, which is open versus proprietary. We have a leg in both of those buckets. I don't know if that's the right metaphor. I don't know if you have legs in buckets, but
a horse in each
horse in each race.
A horse in each bucket. That's wrong.
Right. Yeah. So the thing that open is really powerful for sometimes is really fantastic single player mode. You like take the thing, you install it on your machine. You don't have to think too hard about state. Like state is provided by your file system. This is how DBT core works. And then you start getting into certain things that are less well facilitated in open source world. And it occurs to me that your environment is very similar. I didn't actually realize this until hearing you talk about all of the real timiness of what you folks are building. But Jupyter does a lot of what you do if you take out all of this like technically hard stuff. It's like the kind of the single player mode of what you're, and certainly there's like user interface experiences that you folks have built that don't exist in core Jupyter, but there's a little bit of this like single versus multiplayer. And I wonder if that's partially the reason that you folks have chosen to, I think you're fully proprietary. Is that true?
Yeah, right now we're fully proprietary.
Okay. I'd love to hear you talk about, I'm sure you've had to do your own version of thinking around like, how do we differentiate versus the prior art that is open in the space? And I find that stuff fascinating. Maybe it's just me because like I've had to think about a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It's one that we've talked really extensively about internally. Both, I think there's two pieces of it. One is open versus proprietary. And then the other one is basically how much do we want to be and how closely do we want to be tied to the Jupyter specific implementations of various different things.
Yeah.
And I think both of those are actually very interesting and complicated product strategy questions. And then on the open versus proprietary thing, what I've seen work really well with open source is sort of self-contained modules. And I think this is a little bit kind of what you were seeing with like, okay, well, I can like download and install DBT and I can run it and it's a piece of my larger infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for tools where, especially for tools for folks who are like backend developers or infrastructure or DevOps or things like that, where people want to have a lot of fine-grained control over the different pieces of their system and how that's working, I do think open source can work really well. And I also think it helps on the development side because the module has a very well-defined, like, okay, well, this is what we're building. And, this is sort of the product definition for it. And this is how you contribute and things like that. I think on our end, we really did want to build this sort of end-to-end integrated experience. And even just like not even going all the way to open, we experimented with self-hosting, right? So, I think that would be sort of one step prior to, okay, we're going to open source it and you can just download it and whatever in terms of the availability of it. And just what we found is that there's so many pieces to it and so many moving parts that as an engineering team, we can provide you a very seamless experience for folks. But for the analysts, they really didn't want to see all of that stuff that was inside the black box. And so instead, we're working on, we do single tenant deployments and things like that are managed by us rather than self-hosting because it just wasn't added value for them. That's sort of where we are right now. I do think that open sourcing and using open source and contributing back to open source is something that's important to us. And so I do think we will slide on that spectrum depending on, sort of where we are and what we're seeing. But for now, that was kind of the decision that we made is that people in our user demographic don't really need that level of fine-grained control.
So the end result, I guess, of all this hard engineering work and product work is that you've given people a way to create these data apps. And it's almost like a low-code way to build apps, right? All they need is a little bit of Python or a little bit of SQL, and you create all of the other UI and components to put together so that you can serve that data in an interesting way to other consumers. Have you been at all surprised by how people end up using Hex, or do they use it in the way that you intended it to be used when you thought it up before you actually had a product?
I think adhering to our philosophy of low bar, high ceiling, we have just opened up in some ways such a can of worms that creates a lot of technical problems for us that we have to that we have to then go and solve. But I am constantly surprised by what people are building in Hex and impressed, quite frankly. Some of the most gratifying moments for me are when we have users come to us and be like, I automated all of my manual work in Hex. And like, that's awesome. And all of a sudden they're like leveraging their time like 10 or 100x because they're being able to build a bunch of not just sort of read-only dashboards, but really because they have all of the power of Python underlying it, actual full workflow tools in the product, which I think is pretty cool. There's even some crazy examples where people are like managing support tickets in Hex and use cases that you would never in a million years have expected people to do, but Hex just becomes the tool where it's the fastest to get those things developed and out the door and then maintain them.
Yeah, I imagine you have this, like, because you have the drop-down widgets where you can filter on things or change inputs on the fly. I imagine people are creating like mini apps. It's not just a dashboard. It's not just to see your data or information, but you get to interact with it, collaborate all within those data sets. So when you create a platform that's really flexible, you end up with a whole different host of use cases that maybe you didn't anticipate when you initially designed it.
Julia, have you used the client lookup tool that someone built internally at DBT Labs? We're Hex users.
I haven't seen that view.
Yeah, somebody internally, and maybe we can talk about like the difference between the Hex app experience versus dashboards, because we have in the past had, like every company in the known universe, have dashboards that have to do with our customers. And it's very hard for me to describe like exactly how the interactivity changed the experience from like this, I'll say static, but I think that word doesn't fully capture like the difference there. Somebody on the team built this fantastic Hex product and released it. And the responses in the thread were like, literally, what is this magic? And I know, Julia, this is one of the directions that you wanted to go in. Like, what is, like, if there is magic there, what is that thing that somebody is reacting to? Like, what does it unlock when you build one of these more interactive experiences?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple places where I see magic when we show this to people for the first time or when they've been using it for a while. And I think the two things that I would call out there are in the building of the dashboard, or not dashboard, but app, I guess, is I think a more accurate term of describing some of these things. It's just the ability to go hook up to your data, write a couple lines of code, put it in a thing, and then ship that out within, I don't know, you can do it in 10 minutes.
Sure.
And people who have never seen anything like that are just like, oh my God, I spent 5 hours making this slide deck and now I can do this in 30 seconds. And then on the other end, I think part of the problem with dashboards in some ways is that they don't actually integrate super well into the actual work to be done. Like you look at the dashboard and you're like, okay, well, here are the numbers. And now I need to still go and do a whole bunch of other things based on those numbers. And so they take some chunk of the workflow out, but they're not actually solving your problem. Whereas if you build a data app, you can actually build in and automate out a bunch more and a much larger swath of the workflow that is coming out of the analytics that you're doing. And that's where you get some of these magic things, like people who are like one-man shows on their data team being able to build a whole bunch of these complex data workflows out because they can automate it in Hex in ways that they wouldn't have been able to if they'd just been emailing someone a dashboard. And then that person is like, okay, based on X, Y, and Z, I need all of these other things. And you have to go do them yourself.
Hey, everyone. Just dropping in to let you know that the annual Analytics Engineering Conference, Coalesce, is back. We had the first Coalesce last year in December, and it was fantastic. We had 3,000 registrants, tons of presentations, and this year is going to be even bigger. Register for free at coalesce.getdbt.com.
There's been like a lot of people talking about the death of the dashboard. And I know, Tristan, you've written about that. You know, I believe dashboards will never die. I think there's a huge need for them, but it's different, right? It's like curated information, my most important metrics that I need to keep track of on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. I get insight by looking at when things look off versus doing a deeper exploration or then using my dashboard to go do some workflow. And so I think that's really the missing gap piece here that you're trying to solve is how do I take data in a dashboard like thing, call it a data app, but really make it your workflow, part of your workflow, so you can take it a step further and take action based on the information you see.
I agree. We've seen people build these things over and over and over again, and being able to like one thing that, again, in terms of things that surprised me about what people build with Hex, write back workflows are exceedingly common. They'll have your data lake where, you have your tables, but, you need to add some extra metadata, or maybe there's like your correlating data that's coming in from a different source or things like that. So they'll basically have workflows where the app will be, okay, well, let me filter down to this data set that I care about. We actually have like a little mini spreadsheet component. So you can like enter in new information about those different entries, and then you can write it back to the data warehouse as a separate cleaned or enhanced or whatever table you want.
You'll literally run like a single update statement on a single row in a data warehouse?
It's usually we recommend writing to a separate table for that.
Okay. No, I find that so interesting because, I've talked to other folks in the ecosystem, and data warehouses would have you believe that they are designed for batch operations, but it turns out that oftentimes the workloads don't match what the docs suggest. Who would have thought? And there's like a lot more of what you're describing going on in the, Redshift, Snowflake, BigQuery ecosystem than I would have imagined. That's neat.
as much as we're getting all of this incredible tooling and this explosion in that space, I think at the heart of it, a lot of data today is still very people driven. And so in some ways, enabling people to do those kinds of things can create really powerful things that you wouldn't have been able to do with just sort of the straight automation.
One final question I have. It feels like we're at the beginning of something new. We've been describing it in a lot of different ways, this thing that Hex is or that you're building. Is this a new category that you're defining, like the collaborative data app, or how do you talk about it? Or are there other people thinking about this problem in the same way that Hex is?
Yeah, I do feel like it is a bit of a new category. I think similar to the way you all have been talking about analytics engineers and analytics engineering as a new discipline. It's not like any specific part of that. They have their roots in other things, but this category of work didn't exist 10 years ago and has rapidly sort of developed into this broad discipline. I do think that there's a similar change happening in the more analytics side. So not just kind of in the data engineering and the pipeline and the transformation side, but also in analytics, and maybe just like a year or two or three kind of behind in how it's evolving. And that is to basically, as I was saying earlier, use code-driven tooling to do the analytics workflows that before would have been point and click. They would have been in the Tableau, Looker, Excel, all of these things, moving those into more of an engineering discipline. And I don't think that I certainly haven't seen a lot of things out in the space that are conceptualizing it like that. And I do think, there are products that, do great jobs at slices of this workflow. Like there are great collaborative notebooks out there and there are great SQL editors out there, but thinking about it as a discipline and thinking about it as a set of sort of really connected workflows is something that we think a lot about at Hex. And I haven't heard a lot of other people conceptualizing it in the same way. And I do think that leads us to a lot of really interesting opportunities to innovate in that space and kind of look beyond a little bit what we're seeing in sort of existing tooling and stapling together a bunch of existing projects and think about, okay, well, if you were to reinvent from scratch what this population of users actually needs and wants, what would that actually look like? And that's some of the things that I'm most excited about looking at in the coming months and years.
So you may have already answered this question, but we ask this for all of our guests. But looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
When I think about questions like this, I think about my experience with web development. So I started my software engineering career as a web developer. You could like not even really call it a front-end engineer at that point. That's how primitive a lot of the tooling was. And over my time there, I just saw it go from this Wild West. Frameworks were terrible. The language was like barely usable into a mature software engineering discipline. And I don't think looking at it today, 10 years ago, I could have predicted all of the ways that would have evolved and that would have developed. Like who knew that functional programming with React was going to be the object oriented was all everybody did back then. And like the way of the future was actually this totally different thing. And so when I think about where we are in the data space, and especially on some of the analytics side, I feel like we're still pretty early in that journey. And we're seeing a lot of these like awesome new ideas come out. But for me, I think in 10 years, the thing that I would love most is just to be completely surprised. I think some of the most transformative stuff, maybe we haven't even seen yet. And I can't wait to see what that looks like in like 5 to 10 years down the line.
I feel like software engineering has gone through a number of those transitions over the decades. It's like people kind of expect that in 5 years, they're going to have to learn a whole new set of skills. But in data, that has not been true historically. People are just like, they cling to their tools in the same way that Charlton Heston clung? Is that clung? Onto something else. But I love that answer because what you're really saying is you're just excited about the rate of change increasing, I think. And I think that the entire industry is moving in that direction. Like people are starting to acquire new skills faster than they used to. They're being more open to ideas that maybe they should be working differently. Maybe new people should be involved in the process. Like all of that feels very exciting to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I think about what they say about photography or, the way to take a great photograph is to take lots of them. And I think that's similar here where the way to have a great idea or the way to have an industry that evolves is to have a lot of really interesting ideas, and some of them will work and some of them won't work and some of them will be really transformative. And that's really what I see going on right now. And that's super exciting.
Before you head out, where should people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn or you can find me at my email, Caitlin@hex.tech. Just reach out. Happy to chat.
Awesome. Caitlin, thanks for joining us. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.